Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren.
Good morning. Last Sunday, we dealt with the last chapter, the last several verses in the last chapter of the book of James, James chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. Today we pay some attention to the front end of the book of James, and in the reading that we just had by Bryce a couple of moments ago, particularly in verses 12 through 16, actually some observations through 18 as well that I want us to be thinking about this morning. I want to say in the very beginning of this lesson that temptation and falling prey to it is all around us every single day. And there's no denying it. However, do we sometimes deceive ourselves in ignoring what we sometimes use in the expression, an elephant in the room, or I might even put that in plural because I think at times there are several elephants in the room in the particular setting of which we may be discussing. In James chapter 1 and verse 16, James makes a statement there that really is twofold in its purpose. And he says, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Understand, first of all, that as we made the observation last Sunday that James is speaking to Christians about Christians, that is still the truth in the context that this is written to Christians. And why he says, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. But this statement about deception serves as an interesting transition between verses 12 and 15 and then verses 17 and 18. Now, the first thing that he does in verses 12 through 15, in so many respects, that he points out what God is not. In the beginning of verse 12, blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Now, as much as that is true, in those preceding verses of not being deceived, it really serves to show something else, and that is found in verses 17 and 18. Because while the preceding verses show that God is not and never has been the source of temptation is sin, on the contrary, what God is he is the giver of every good gift. And do not be deceived. God only gives good gifts. Verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. And those expressions are pointing out that God is immutable. He does not change. No shadow of turning. That we can always count on God. and that he is the giver of every good and perfect gift. Verse 18, of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be, that is Christians, a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And that while man, as we discussed in the adult Bible class this morning, is the crowning glory of God's creation, and that is true, as man was created on the sixth day, that understands spiritually that we that have been sanctified by the blood of Jesus Christ in our obedience to the saving gospel, that we have become these first fruits of his creatures. And God provides for his people. He provides for mankind in general every good and perfect gift. But of all people upon the planet, on the face of the earth, we should appreciate more than anybody else that God is the giver of only good gifts. Do you believe that? So do not be deceived about any of this, because many are. Many are, and especially those that want to blame God about their position, their circumstance, or their lot in life. And James is saying, do not be deceived. Brethren, one thing that we learn from the very beginning of time is that we look at biblical history and how it has been chronicled from the beginning of time, from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel to the days of Noah to Sodom and Gomorrah, the Tower of Babel, and on throughout, that when man finds himself in sinful positions, conditions, in these deplorable, despicable states, whose fault is it? God did not do that. But God places man in a world of which he's allowed man to become what? A free moral agent. Volition, choice. God has made us free moral agents. And as we have the ability to make these choices in life, and we think of a few of these statements, the powerful statement that we're all familiar with in Joshua 24:15, when Joshua, before he dies, one of his final speeches to the children of Israel, says to the Israelites, and if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods in which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land who you now dwell. But then Joshua says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But what that passage points out, that we have a choice, don't we? Choose for yourselves this day. The mighty prophet Elijah, that after he had this incredible mountain debate with the prophets of Baal, and now he makes an appeal to the children of Israel that they too have to make a choice. And in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 21, Elijah came to all the people and said, how long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people answered him not a word. And I wonder how many people are today that we can show them what the choices are, that we have to make a choice. Listen, every one of us, we have to make a choice who we're going to serve. We make a choice if we're going to accept and obey the gospel or not. We make a choice if we're going to set our sights, our goals on heaven, or if we're going to ignore that and be influenced by other things in this life. I want to tell you, it's all about choices. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul warns Christians in the various churches and the congregations in the region of Galatia. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, he says, do not be deceived, even as James did. He said, do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, and especially to those of the household of faith. Ladies and gentlemen, it has always been about choices. And God allows us, with this volition, with this power, to make choices. The biggest problem that we face in life The biggest problem, and there's some big problems in life, but I want to tell you the biggest problem that we face is not the Syrians, and it's not the Russians, and it's not the North Koreans, and it's not China, it's not any of those things. And I want to tell you, those may be global problems today. Make no mistake. But the biggest problem we face in lives is the problem of temptation and sin. And yet sometimes we act as though it doesn't exist. And how many times have you been in situations, maybe it's at your job, maybe it's been in your family, and there always seems to be in the minds of some that issue that's there, it's looming, it's there. It's like this huge elephant in the room, and people just choose to ignore it. And as I've been contemplating this for several days now, the thought has occurred to me that there's a lot of elephants in the room that maybe we have been ignoring, that we need to address, that we need to understand. And I want to do this without being insensitive. I want to do this without being offensive, but I want to do this in a way that we clearly understand, language that we understand, scripture that needs to be recognized, things that need to be done, things that need to be changed in our lives. We talk about the deception of sin, the elephant in the room, and may I say to you that we have this whole problem of sin's entanglement. Let's leave James and just go to the book that precedes it in the book of Hebrews just for a moment, if you will, please, in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. And most of you are familiar with this passage, but we are told in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse number 1. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse number 1. Lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. The word entangle, I think, is one that we can relate to. Because there are things in this life that just cause us to get all tangled up and trip us up and just absolutely take our focus away from what it must be. Do we see that? I don't know if any of you are familiar with Sir Walter Scott's classic work, Marmion. It's a poem based loosely on a real-life situation. But probably the most famous quote that comes from that particular poem is, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive." It's centuries before Sir Walter Scott would ever even think to write such a line that had so much meaning, so much truth to it, I might add. We have Scripture telling us about the problem of temptation and sin. Lay aside every encumbrance of sin, which so easily entangles us. And do what? And run with endurance the race that is set before us. And we must acknowledge that which easily ensnares us, one translation says. We know what a snare is. We know what a trap is. This entanglement. Now what James calls it, back when we look at James, when he in the text there, and he talks again, that he says, "Let no one say when I am tempted that he is tempted by God. God cannot be tempted by evil. He does not tempt anyone to evil." But remember, he says, "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own" what? "Desires or lust is enticed." Now that's a very, very interesting word that James uses. And James calls this lust or desire, how we translate it in English. But the word that he uses is epithumia. And it's a longing, Strong says in his lexicon, it's a longing for something that is forbidden. It is used in a negative sense. It could be translated and understood as inordinate desire. The desiring for something or the lusting for something that's not right, that we should not do. Anytime, as I brought out even in the class this morning, that we have this prefix, this epi, this EPI, it's the idea of over, upon, and thumos. There is passion. It's a boiling up, Thayer says. It's a boiling up, a welling up of passion. But this we're going to see is a passion that takes us in a wrong direction. In fact, Jesus uses this exact same word. And it's only found really not that many times, a handful of times as we see in the New Testament. But Jesus uses it in reference to the hypocritical Jews. In John chapter 8 and verse 44, when he says to those Jews, you are of your father the devil, the desires of your father. Now who's their father? The devil. The desires of your father you want to do. And he goes on to talk about Satan being a murderer from the beginning and so forth. But I want us to understand that when James uses this word lust or desire, this epithumia, this is a very, very strong word. Now, John the Apostle is going to use it as well. In a passage that we're familiar with also, and that takes us to 1 John chapter 2. And in 1 John chapter 2, and beginning at verse 15 is why the Apostle John writes to Christians, and he says, do not love the world, nor the things that are in the world. For if anyone loves the world, any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world is what? The lust of the flesh, epithumia. The lust of the eyes, epithumia. Then he identifies also something known as the pride of life. And I think most of us recognize that those are three avenues of temptation that lead to sin, correct? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And so 2 times we see there that he uses this very, very strong word. John, like James, like Jesus, identifies what man faces. But so often we're ignoring it. And brethren, you've got to hear me. You've got to listen to me. Because so many of these things are the elephants in the room that I want to talk about. When he talks about lust or desire, this epithumia, the very first thing that he identifies is this lust of the flesh, and so often that is seen in the problem of sexual immorality. Of sexual immorality, the lust of the flesh. And there are so many elephants in the room when it comes to that in our society today. And it is something that has bombarded our society. It is something that has found its way into too many homes, too many places of a variety of forms of sexual immorality. And I'll tell you the one elephant that's in the room that a lot of people are ignoring and acting as though it does not exist. And just think about the term sexual immorality as it's translated in many translations. You may have a translation that says fornication, and just listen to the Greek word. We know the Greek word porneia. And I will tell you that the elephant in the room in so many places is the problem that we have with pornography in our society today. And it's everywhere. It's available everywhere. It has become so open. I just want to ask you, has that become an elephant in the room with you, any of you? That we look at this and we see that the problem is, and what it is becoming the corruption and the decay of morality, of a spiritual mindset. It has such an addictive influence that it's crazy. Read the books, look at the studies, see the problems that it has created. It is an elephant in the room that has been absolutely ignored by some. In fact, perhaps that there's been a wonderment about it. Even by spouses or by good friends or brethren and so forth. And it has become one of those issues that we dance around and that we do not want to meet directly on. I want to tell you right now, it has become so destructive in our society. What deception It's been around for a long time, but the proliferation of it, the abundance of it now is absolutely mind-boggling. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Does this subject make you feel uncomfortable? It does me. That's not all. I don't know how many times recently I've driven, the other day I've gone to the hospital, the French hospital. I don't know why, we've had a bunch there lately. I can't remember which one it was, but as I'm driving back, I'm going down California because I'm going to go down to Foothill and turn left and go all the way back out to LOVR, come back to the office here at the building. But I'm there at the corner of California and Foothill, call to students every day. It was a particularly nice day, almost warm even. And I want to tell you what, the dress that I saw among so many of the young college co-eds leaves nothing to the imagination. And it's the elephant in the room that even with some of our own parents from time to time, and I've seen it historically, and I've seen it, and I'll tell you what, moms and dads, you better be teaching your children about the facts of life. And then we wonder why we have these kinds of problems. And we wonder why that there's, and I'm not just trying to blame it on the young girls. Please don't get me wrong, because I'll tell you what, it can be the other way too. And it could be the whole attitude. I could not believe some years, not that many years ago, when I was coaching football at Morro Bay High School. And when I saw the advancements and what kids talked about and what they did, and it was unbelievable. And I'll tell you, I'm going to say this right now, that I saw situations of some young men that I'm coaching football, and I never seen such forward girls in my life. You know what, Coach Willey? I had some heart-to-heart talks with these guys, and I probably violated every code there was in a public school on the football field as I shared Scripture with them. But you know what? We ignore it. We act like it's not there at times. Sexual immorality, the lust of the flesh, and it seems so right at the time. Because that's how Satan works. It seems so right at the time. And we begin to justify and rationalize and do all of this. And to the extent that not only do we have young people like high school students or college-age students that have become so involved in such a morally loose, sexually permissive society today, I wanted to know how many marriages is it ruining? That's not the only elephant in the room. Covetousness, the lust of the eyes. And while that also can have its place, certainly, in the passions of the flesh and what we look at and what we allow our eyes to perceive, there's something else very interesting about covetousness. Because covetousness is something, again, that we desire. It's also in and of itself its own kind of inordinate desire. To want something so much, to want something so bad. And this is not just sensual things. This can just simply do at times with materialistic, monetary things, doesn't it? And I'll tell you what the elephant in the room is sometimes, and where it's affecting us. Where we find it becomes so necessary because we are up to our eyeballs in debt. And because we make bad choices about what we purchase and what we do, and in this fast-paced world, that we've got to work an inordinate amount of hours. And we've got to take a second job and a third job, and we find ourselves that we can't worship God, we can't serve God, we can't spend time with our family the way that we want to because we have things, and because we got to pay off major credit card debt, because we've got to pay a second and third house mortgage, because of all these different kinds of things that are going on. And I want to tell you, it's nothing but pure covetousness. It is a desire for things that, you know what, we would do better without. We find ourselves that we can't be at Bible class and we can't be at services. We find ourselves, we're absenting ourselves, again, from our families, from our marriages, our children, our brethren. We find ourselves, and why? We're doing all of this because we're doing exactly the opposite of what John said in 1 John 2:15. Do not love the world, nor the things that are in the world. God has blessed us immeasurably. Are we a blessed people? Monetarily? Financially? We are in so many ways, but there is this lack of contentment, this lack of being satisfied. And you may never view yourself, oh, I'm not covetous. I want to tell you, there may be an elephant in the room right there. I was teasing somebody the other day, but it's not that much of a joke. I said, you know what, here's the rule. You buy a new car, or if even it's new to you, contribution goes up. I said, no, the contribution goes, no. Now I'm teasing when I say a rule because we don't mandate that. But I want to tell you, there's a problem that when we are so unsatisfied and we put ourselves in a situation and say, well, because I'm going to better myself in my automobile bill, or better myself in my house, or better myself in some financial monetary thing, and then we decrease our contribution, I want to tell you, it's a problem of covetousness. I can preach on that. Does that make sense? But it's the elephant in the room that people don't want to deal with. I heard a fella make a comment on the radio the other day. I listened to a lot. And he was talking about giving a contribution. This is not a religious program. It's a financial program. His name is David Ramsey, and it's not this David Ramsey. I know poor David every time. Boy, I tell you. You wish I got changed name, huh? But he made a remarkable statement. The radio Ramsey. And he says, well, you know what? When it comes to giving contribution, he says, that's not a salvation issue. And I'll tell you what, I've got to disagree with that. Because you know what makes it a salvation issue? It's not a salvation issue from the standpoint necessarily that because, one gives more than others. It's never a comparative thing. It's not that. I want to tell you what, it's a priority issue. And priority issues are always salvation issues. And if we're going to stand before God in judgment of what kind of stewards we've been, what kind of faith we have, what kind of commitment, and what kind of priorities. And I'll tell you the elephant in the room, how many times are the brethren that maybe they're gone on vacation or they're gone for some reason and they don't give, and then they come back and don't give because, well, they missed that week. I tell you what, inasmuch as you shouldn't be going on vacation and not finding some place to worship so you can partake of the Lord's Supper, you should never look at that as though, oh, well, you know what, I was gone, therefore I don't have to give. What is that all about? That didn't even make any sense. You see, it's a priority issue. You know what it is? People look at it and say, the lust of the eyes, it's my needs, my time. My needs, my time. All of this really falls into the category of arrogance. The pride of life, because here is the situation. As though not me, number one, I'm not susceptible. So if you want to talk about the lust of the flesh with pornography or the way people dress and all those things that are around us, the lust of the eyes of what we see again sensually, or even when it comes to monetary, materialistic things, and if we ever look at that and say, oh, I'm not susceptible to that, well, I'll tell you what, that's the pride that goes before the fall, isn't it? And when a man thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:12, and every one of us need to take that to heart. It is the pride of life that says, not me, not me. And I'll tell you right now, are you all listening to me? If there's anybody that's saying, well, you know, these things don't really apply to me, then I'll tell you what, this last point especially applies to you. I meant to say at the beginning of this sermon that some of you will think that I've gone too far. Some of you will think at the conclusion that I didn't go far enough. I don't know what camp you're in at this point. But I want to speak as plainly as I possibly can. It comes down to this: who can deliver us? And a couple of Wednesday nights ago, a couple of weeks ago, Brother John Kruger gave an outstanding invitation. And one of the passages, among a few that he had given, great applications, is he dealt with this classic statement of Paul that I alluded to briefly last week as well, but I want to allude to it again this week. But now I want you to turn over there to Romans chapter 7. And we're going to, first of all, just look at verses 24 and 25. then come back to this and work through it a little bit. And in verse 24 and 25, Paul has come to this conclusion. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And then Paul answers that question, the answer to his own question, because it's quite rhetorical anyway. And again, Paul is personifying. He's using himself, but yet he's just kind of showing this is the problem of the dilemma of man, of what he faces with temptation and sin. And the question is, who can deliver? Who can deliver from this body of sin? And he says in verse 25, I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. Now what Paul has done, even at the beginning of this chapter, but if you'll go back up to about verse 7, Paul shows the relationship between the law and sin. And in verse 7, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? That too is rhetorical. It even says, certainly not. Would any of us ever conclude that any law of God is sin? Of course not. The law is not sin. The law identifies sin. It defines sin. It even highlights sin. On the contrary, verse 7 continue, I would not have known sin, Paul says, except through the law, for I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Understand this, he had already made this very clear in the earlier chapters of Romans, that where there is no law, there is no sin. You can't have sin unless there's law. So when you look at that again, verse 8, but sin taking opportunity by the commandment produced in me all manner of evil desire, for apart from the law, sin was dead. I was once alive without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. I'll tell you, there's only one time that Paul was ever without the law and therefore did not have to worry about condemnation, and that's when he was a young child in a state of innocence. But as he grew, even as a young Jewish man, did he come to understand what God's law was? And yes, and the law defined what covetousness was. The law defined what fornication was. The law defined what lying and cheating, all those kinds of things happen to be from the Ten Commandments and on. And Paul found in himself, he certainly did find times, even through his own life as he looked back, that sin, that law had been violated by himself. Sin brought about that death. But he says in verse 10, and the commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death, because he violated it. For sin taking occasion by the commandment deceived me, and by it killed me. That's strong language. That's what sin does, ladies and gentlemen. It kills, it slays, it destroys. Verse 12, therefore, the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Don't be deceived. Again, let's don't ever say that God tempts anyone, and let us never come to the conclusion, well, that God's law somehow is not good. And that the problem with temptation of sin is really not me. The problem with temptation is sin. Well, you know what? God could have done a better job with the law. Can you imagine even thinking such foolishness? So we have this relationship between the law and the sin, and it's defining it and making us know. So then he goes right into the scenario in the following verses, the struggle with right and wrong that humanity faces. And I know he uses the first personal pronoun, that I, and we can debate all day long. Is he talking about himself? Is he talking about himself historically in the time past, presently, which I don't believe, or is he just using this in a way to define, here's man's struggle with sin, which is a position I hold. But regardless, what he teaches as an absolute truth is there a struggle with sin in our world today. And notice what it does. Verse 13. Has then what is good become death to me, he asks. Certainly not. The law is good. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. Brethren, I'm under the position, I believe that inherently man knows a lot of things that are just right and wrong. And I believe that there's a lot of civilizations out in our world today that have never opened a Bible, never cracked open a Bible, and yet they have this sense of morals that it's wrong to take somebody else's possession. You know what I'm saying? And I think there are a lot of things that just show sin is wrong, sin is wrong. But I want to tell you that when you have the law brought into it to define it, then it shows it's exceedingly sinful. You know why? Because it goes against the nature of God and the will of God. Verse 14, here it is. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I'm carnal, sold under sin. For what am I doing? I do not understand. This is what John highlighted a couple of weeks ago, right, John? He's talking about this tug of war, spiritual tug of war that's going on. For what am I doing? I don't understand. For what I will to do that I do not practice, what I hate that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. Can sin capture people? Yes. Now is he saying, oh, well, sin captured me, it's not my fault. No, that's not his point. His point is that does sin have this powerful effect and influence in the lives of people? And we got to be aware of that, and we are aware of that. I know I've used this illustration throughout the years, and most of you know it, but there's a few of you that don't. I'm just going to use it anyway. But every time I think of this spiritual tug of war that's going on, the very thing that I know that I will to do, that I want to do, and I don't do it because it's right, but I don't do it. And I think, why didn't I do that? And the very thing that I detest, I go, I don't want to do that, and I turn around and I do it. Is that any of us? And I always go back to those old Tom and Jerry cartoons. Back in the day, the good ones, right? And there's Tom and Jerry, and there's some of you young ones. It's a cat and a mouse cartoon. Stay with me. And here's Jerry, the mouse, and Tom's giving him nothing but problems. And Jerry the mouse, he's getting ready to do a terrible, terrible thing to Tom the cat. And all of a sudden, a little angelic mouse pops up on his shoulder, on his right shoulder. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. His conscience working. And then all of a sudden what happens? Because he thinks of that, oh, that'd be a bad thing to do. And then on the left shoulder is this demonic Jerry. Do it, do it, do it. And I'll tell you one thing it does. It illustrates this struggle that we have in these influences. And this is what the Apostle Paul is setting up. This is what he's showing, the struggle with right and wrong. And it's about choices, my friends. It's always about choices. And so that he looks at this, and after giving this, and he talks about the influences that we have. And if you'll drop on down to verse 22, for I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. But I see another law. A law there is the idea of an influence. A compelling influence. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law in my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And my friends, every one of us need to be asking that question repeatedly throughout our lives. O wretched person that I am, who can deliver me? And he gave the answer. I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. I'm going to tell you, with the elephants in the room, the only way we can be delivered is through Jesus Christ, but we've got to stay connected to Jesus Christ, listen, every day. Every day. Morning, noon, and night. Now, this takes us back as we close to Hebrews 12, where we were a little bit ago. And so you go back to Hebrews chapter 12, and we look at this text in verses 1 and 2, and what does the writer do now? He sees this absolute need to remind these brethren about all the witnesses, all the great people of faith in chapter 11. We just had a lectureship of which we dealt with men of faith in chapter 11, right? Hebrews 11. And we've talked about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham. We talked about these people of faith, and there are many others that we didn't even talk about in that powerful chapter. Act as though there's no chapter division, so go right to 12:1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand, the throne of God. And the thing that just really comes out to me in this whole lesson is that we've got to look to these cloud of witnesses. And who are this cloud? What's a cloud? A cloud is it's particulates of water. Billions, right, in a cloud? So what's he saying in this figure of speech? Therefore, since we have this great cloud of witnesses, those are these faithful folks in chapter 11, that we can look to them, we can learn by them, we can understand what that's all about. And all I can tell you, and that's what we need to do, is that we look to the cloud of witnesses in the Bible and let's learn by those. But there's something else that this teaches. We need each other. We need each other. We need to be people of faith, and we need each other. We need to encourage one another. We need to be there for one another. We need to help people. We got to get rid of the blinders. We got to understand that the elephants in the room that we've been ignoring, and we walk in and we occupy a seat, and then we walk out that door, and when our only presence is coming to a service from time to time, and not be involved with our brethren and be involved with people, and find all kinds of excuses why not to be here and not to be a real participant in the Lord's work, it's a failure to understand we need each other. We need the cloud of witnesses. It's what we need. And to remember 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren, that evil companionships corrupt good morals. And so what does he say? In verse 2 of this text, looking unto Jesus. Thank you, Clint, for leading the song. I gave Clint no suggestions. I told him I was preaching on, and thank you. Looking to thee. Looking unto Jesus, and the reason why we can look to Jesus is we're studying the book of Hebrews, is that he faced temptation. Hebrews 4:15 points out that he was tempted in all points, even as we are, yet without sin. Now, while we need each other, and we need the cloud of witnesses in the final analysis, you know who we really got to look to? Because there may be times I'll let you down. And there may be times that we might let one another down. But I'll tell you who will never let you down. And that's Jesus. Look to Jesus. And when we take our focus off of him, life becomes a miserable experience. I thank you for your attention. But I will thank you more for your meditation, your consideration, prayerful consideration of the things that I've tried to present today before you. Let's do the right thing when temptation confronts us. Let's be open about it. Let's be honest about it. Let us help one another. If you're here this morning and you're ready to become a Christian, I'll tell you, don't put it off. Quit trying to come up with the excuses of why you're not going to do it today when you know what to do. Do the right thing. And if you find yourself in you're out there and there's things going on in your life and maybe nobody else knows about, do the right thing. And let's quit ignoring elephants if we can help you in any way. Come at this time as we stand and sing the song.